In 1945, a young Egyptian farmer discovered some clay jars in the back of a cave near the city of Nag Hammadi, Egypt. Inside these clay jars were 13 leather-bound codices comprising 52 mostly Gnostic texts. These texts have been translated and represent one of the greatest archaeological as well as philosophical discoveries of all time. For the first time in history, the ancient Gnostics revealed their knowledge without the interference of a pope or monarch. What we discover is a far different view of reality than that of the other three main Western religions.
The Gnostic texts are a collection of books that were discovered in Nag Hammadi, Egypt in 1945. They represent the writings of the earliest or first Christians. In fact, the Gnostic texts themselves tell us that they were written by the disciples of Jesus who appeared to them after his resurrection and gave them instructions and navigational formulas for traveling in the afterlife. So the Gnostic texts are really considered to be the secret or lost teachings of Jesus. Gnosis is a Greek word that means knowledge. The Gnostics believed that we each had within us a divine spark that manifested our physical human body as a vehicle for exploration in this realm, but ultimately that our divine spark became trapped in this realm. And the only way to escape earth life was to achieve knowledge, enlightenment, or gnosis. Gnosticism is really the self-realization or enlightenment of the divine spark within us. The Nag Hammadi texts are vital to us to understand the earliest form of Christianity, in fact, the true form of Christianity. Many of them were written between 200 and 350 to 400 AD, before Christianity in the New Testament as we know it was codified. So it's actually a different story and a different take on Christianity, and the important part of it is that these are the teachings of the living, risen, or resurrected Jesus. Traditional Christianity, the New Testament, focuses on the words that Jesus spoke while he was in the flesh and blood body. The Gnostic texts are the teachings of Jesus in his celestial flesh, where he's returning after his resurrection to assist the Gnostics in guiding them into the afterlife and navigating the afterlife realms, the kingdom of heaven. Because the Gnostic texts referred to the teachings of the living Jesus, they were a threat to traditional Christianity. And this is why they are attacked by Orthodox or traditional Christians.
Fascinating movement that took place between roughly 600 BC and just a little into the AD years, almost 1,000 years, where all of a sudden all these philosophies arose, like some of the philosophies of Plato. The Gnostics later came along that adopted some of those philosophies. And in India, you get the similar thing. They often started off as philosophies like Buddhism, where Buddha said the gods are not the highest thing here, and these philosophies generally tried to help people escape the reincarnation process. For example, some of the Greek philosophers that arose from Platonic philosophy saying the same thing. And the reincarnation process, if you read the old creation stories, was necessary to create a slave race. You had to basically keep a soul in the human body and keep it stuck there, or at least returning, if you wanted to keep the slave race going. And that's what one of the very first creation stories talks about, like when they bioengineered human beings, they had to put a soul, they had to put a consciousness in that body to make it work, right? But what if the consciousness says, I'm sick of this. I'd rather go be something else. I don't want to come back and be a human and slave again on these stupid building projects and starve and all of that, or be blasted by these ETs. So basically a reincarnation, an involuntary reincarnation process had to be instituted. And what these philosophies started to do, they started to say, no, this is not healthy. We have to escape that, and that was rather revolutionary. And to me, it's not necessarily that you have to escape it, it's just having the choice, whether you want to or not. And right now, there's a whole persuasion process that's described in some of the near-death studies, or I should say the intra-life studies also, that say there's just a very strong persuasion process that causes humans to keep coming back, even reluctantly.
The Dead Sea Scrolls are the books written by Jewish mystics who called themselves the Essenes. These were individuals who claimed they were living with angels and had received teachings about human transformation into celestial beings. Their texts were stashed away when Rome invaded Palestine in 70 AD, hidden away in caves, and they were discovered surreptitiously in 1947 and caused a worldwide sensation upon their discovery. They are essentially Gnostic in nature because the Essenes themselves were Gnostics. They were interested in self-realization and the perfection of the human body, the transformation of the body into a celestial form or a light body form. The Dead Sea Scrolls are not labeled Gnostic texts as are the Nag Hammadi library, but the core of them, the heart of them, is Gnostic in nature. When we read the Dead Sea Scrolls, it becomes very clear that the Essenes, these Jewish mystics, Gnostic mystics, were having close encounters of the first, second, third, and fourth kind. They said they were seeing angels. They were seeing things in the sky. Portals were opening in the sky. But beyond that, they also had close encounters of the fifth, sixth, seventh, and eighth kind. The close encounter of the eighth kind is human transformation into a celestial being. The Dead Sea Scrolls clearly describes humans being taken, possibly abducted in a modern conversation, but they didn't think of it as abduction then. They're taken into the celestial realms and transformed into an extraterrestrial or celestial being by angels who themselves were extraterrestrials. So the Dead Sea Scrolls are actually a first moment of disclosure, is what they are. This is very important because when they were discovered in 1947, there was a parallel event, the Roswell crash, when for the first time in modern history, following shortly on Kenneth Arnold's sighting of a squadron of flying discs, that mass consciousness began to think about the possibility of extraterrestrial visitors vis-a-vis the Roswell crash. So it's very powerful confluence there, or synchronicity, that the Dead Sea Scrolls come out of the ground at the very same time that a celestial disk crashes into the ground in Roswell, and now we have this mixture happening. It's like, okay, how do these two things relate? Is it possible that some of the entities that are described in the Gnostic texts, the archons, for example, match up with the entities, the alleged entities that were found in the crash disk at Roswell? When the Essenes are talking about dealing with extraterrestrial beings, are these angels, or are these somehow some other kind of celestial or extraterrestrial races? Very important, very powerful questions.
And there's one interesting survey done by Helen Wambach. She surveyed her hypnotic regression subjects, about several hundred of them, and said, did you want to come back after the between lives? Did you want to come back to Earth? 2/3 said, no way, I didn't want to come back here. and we see that in the near-death studies too. Dr. Long has pointed that out too, that even before they go, even when they're going to come back, they say, I don't want to come back here. So that just shows that there's sort of a problem in this process. I like to contrast those studies and this information about the reluctance today of people who have these experiences and the reluctance then to come back to Earth to show why these philosophies may have arisen, like with Buddhism and all that. Why, yeah, you shouldn't have to come back. But then the modern studies then show this very powerful persuasion process to get people to come back. Like, oh, you have a mission, you have something you need to learn, and then people kind of go, oh, okay, I'll go back then. It's sort of the attitude. But like I said, human life can be good. It's just, if the conditions were improved, human life can be fun. There's so much evidence right now, I think, in near-death studies, in the between lives studies, reincarnation studies, good serious work by real professional people doing it. I think it's just inescapable to conclude that, yeah, the consciousness is separate from the body, that the body relies on this separate consciousness. People call it a spirit, a soul, whatever you want to call it. So the ancient Greeks, they started to develop a philosophy that the body became a prison for the soul. And that became then the Gnostic idea that grew out of some of this Greek philosophy and became a very popular idea even with the early Christians. It doesn't need to be a prison for the soul. It's just the way it got manipulated into perhaps this between lives amnesia, where we forget, where we can't really remember anymore that we are really a consciousness that has this longer continuum. Then maybe it becomes a prison. But if we start having those memories, if we start realizing, hey, this can just be a playground, I think it has the capacity to be a playground for the soul, using the bodies and doing all these things and having all these experiences. So it just depends on what is made of Earth experience as to whether it's a prison or whether it's a little toy that we can play with.
What I found so compelling about the Nag Hammadi texts, well, a number of things. One, that they were where they were for so long, from it's estimated maybe 400 BC and the information going back further, that they couldn't be messed with, like the texts in the religious books that have been out in the open and therefore had the potential for being changed. And of course, biblical texts have been changed massively. So that was a big, compelling thing for me, that you were looking at what they really said rather than a manipulated version of it. But what hit me more than anything else, and was important for me, is that I came across them only after I had concluded many, many things from other sources of research since 1990. And so I wasn't looking at them as a one-stop shop for a belief system. Oh, the Nag Hammadi text, that's my belief system. They were more a confirmation, another significant strand in the tapestry of the correlation of information, ancient and modern. And what do they talk about? They talked about a force which they called archons. They call them the formless ones because in their base state they have really no form. And I symbolized this archontic force, shall we say, as basically a computer virus. It's a very, very distorted state of awareness. And when it manifests itself in some extreme in humanity, we call these people psychopaths. It's a deeply, deeply extreme beyond belief, psychopathic state of awareness. And they describe how this awareness, which they call, among other names, the demiurge or the ruler, created a fake reality by making a sort of bad copy of the original reality. Now, we're back here to the ancient modern correlation, because I'm saying what they were describing in their own language and their own symbolism from long ago as we perceive time, another illusion, is actually they're describing the creation of the simulation. And it is my view that the Lord, God, and the Gnostics who were responsible for these Nag Hammadi texts, the Gnostic belief system, they describe the main manifestation of this force as the Lord Archon or Demiurge.
The Essenes, when they wrote their Dead Sea Scrolls, knew that this information was very powerful for humanity. They were hunted by Rome. They represented a direct threat to the power structure of that time. When the Dead Sea Scrolls come out of the ground in 1947, they too represent a direct threat to the existing power structures of the world, the US government and the religious structures that developed around Christianity. Because what they drew into question severely was, is this the origins of Christianity? Was Jesus an Essene? John the Baptist was. John the Baptist initiated Jesus, attuned him in the baptism. Was he connecting him somehow to an extraterrestrial race? Suddenly Christianity starts to sound like it's an alien religion, or a religion that was brought to earth or promoted by extraterrestrial beings. That represents a direct threat to the powers that be. And this is one of the reasons why the Dead Sea Scrolls were covered up for as many as 3 or 4 decades. Initial reports came out about what was contained in the scrolls, but the scholars withheld vast amounts of it for decades. And I believe the reason why is because of its constant references to extraterrestrial beings, portals, celestial realms, celestial cities, all kinds of otherworldly entities that are described in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and how they were actually living with and teaching the Essenes.
According to the Gnostics, the goddess Sophia left her home in the center of the galaxy because she wanted to create a world of unlimited possibilities. She built this world on Earth by creating all of the life forms that have ever existed here. Her creation was amazing. The plethora of life forms she created was unlike anything that had ever been tried before.
In the Gnostic context, Sophia is considered to be the female counterpart of the Creator. She is a renegade, too, because she breaks away from the heavenly realm called the Pleroma and crosses over what then was perceived to be a forbidden boundary between the material and the immaterial realm, and has a hand in creating the material realm in which we live. The word Pleroma means the fullness. or completion. It's equated with heaven. And some people actually believe it has a physical location in the center of our Milky Way galaxy. There's no question that there was a Hindu and Buddhist influence on the development of Gnosticism, going all the way back to 600 BC in Babylon, when the Jews were taken captive from Jerusalem and taken to Babylon, and they're first introduced to the dualistic religion of the Zoroastrians. They start to pick up this idea of the battle between light and dark that is foundational to Gnosticism. 300 years later, these same Jewish mystics go and live in Alexandria, Egypt. At the same time they're there, we have Buddhist missionaries coming from India to Alexandria, where there's this amazing library, the Library of Alexandria, and scholars gathering from all over the Middle East and throughout Asia, and they're all formulating ideas about what? About human transformation, about human ascension into the celestial realms. And this becomes the foundation then of the Essene movement. The Essenes movement actually started with the Therapeutae, who were Buddhist missionaries in Alexandria, bringing this gnosis to that part of the world. Then the Essenes go back to Jerusalem, back to Palestine. They become the progenitors of the later Gnostics. The Gnostics can be described as the children of the Essenes, but the Essenes themselves are children of the Buddhist missionaries who brought this gnosis from India. So we see that we've got a real lineage here that we're actually dealing with. Christos is a light force or a spiritual force. It's transmittable. We know this because John the Baptist was the Essene baptizer of Jesus, and at the baptism, he transmitted to him the Holy Spirit, which is the Christos. After the baptism, Jesus now is referred to as the Christos, or the Anointed One, because he has received this light force or vibration. In the Gnostic context, the archons are referred to as the rulers. They're thought of as agents of the demiurge, the creator of the universe. The Apostle Paul is not very complimentary towards the archons, describing them as demonic beings who seek to control the human race. He wrote letters warning humanity about the archons and how they are attempting to infiltrate the human race.
The Gnostic texts are constantly pointing out that they believed the Earth was being invaded from an off-planet species called the Archons. The Archons were like an intergalactic spiritual parasite that invades the minds and psyches of common people, turning them into a type of psychopath. The Gnostics believed that these negative entities had entered into the psyches of most of our leaders, whether they're kings or politicians. The Gnostics preached that one must never fall under the sway of a leader or a religion, as that would open one up to these alien forces.
I say that what's being described in Genesis is not the creation of the world, but the creation of the simulation. And the bloodthirsty God of the Old Testament, I say, is this archontic force. And the Gnostics described how, in very similar terms, although from another angle, as the Bible talks about how the sons of God, actually the sons of the gods in the original text, interbred with the daughters of men and basically changed the human race. What the Gnostics do is talk about basically the same thing in the Nag Hammadi texts, but they talk about the infusion as a result of this of what they call the counterfeit spirit. The counterfeit spirit is, for me, an expression of this distortion. And the common theme through the ages of some force of good and some force of what people call evil battling for supremacy. When people talk about they have a dark side, I say that's this counterfeit spirit. And the Native Americans have this concept of two wolves inside people. One is goodness and empathy and compassion. One is evil, violence, hatred. And they say, which wolf wins? The one you feed the most. And of course, we have a society in this fake reality specifically designed to make us feed the counterfeit spirit, which is this archontic distortion, as I call it, influencing human behavior and human perception. And it's a frequency band. It has to be, because it's a manifestation of the archontic frequency band.
In his letters, Paul is describing the Gnostic theory of alien intrusion, archon intrusion into the human race, and warning us about these extraterrestrial beings that seek to take over our souls. The Zadokим are the ultra-righteous wing of the Essene movement. They believed in human perfection. In other words, that humans can become whole, holy, and complete, just like Adam and Eve. In the Gnostic belief, in the Garden of Eden story, Adam and Eve did not have bodies of flesh and blood. They had light bodies. And as a punishment, the Old Testament God Yahweh created coats of skin for humanity, the flesh and blood bodies that we inhabit. The Gnostics were intent on reclaiming our original primordial light bodies. And this is what the Zadokim referred to as perfection, returning to our original perfection. And this is very difficult for some people. They look at this and think, well, who are you to become perfect? Nobody's perfect. But the Zadokim believed that humans could transform themselves into perfect light beings, actually returning to our original condition. Gnosticism was attacked and destroyed by Christian orthodoxy because it claimed it possessed the secret teachings of Jesus, of the living Jesus, the risen or resurrected Jesus. Gnosticism also promotes the idea that any individual can have a direct, personal, and visionary experience with the risen Christ. If you can have that, what do you need a pope for? What do you need a priest for? What do you need a church hierarchy for? You don't. The church sells the past Jesus, the past actions. Gnosticism says, let's go into the future. Let's move forward. Today, we are experiencing a dramatic revival of Gnosticism worldwide. We're recovering knowledge of the Gnostic Gospels, where we recovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, and now the public literature is starting to open up to the real secret teachings of Jesus, which is absolutely phenomenal.
So the more that you re-evaluate self-identity from little me to infinite me, the more we expand awareness out of the frequency band of the archontic force of the counterfeit spirit, the less that impacts upon our behavior and our perceptions. And we start to come from the heart. What did the Gnostics say? The counterfeit spirit hardened the hearts of humanity. Exactly what it was designed to do. This is our connection to infinite awareness. They want us here, and here. In the belly, emotion, low vibrational. They don't want us here. It's all systematic. And so, in the end, you can talk forever about the way it's all unfolded and how it's done. But how it's undone is that everything comes from it. This knows because it's connected to that level of awareness that does know. This society worships the intellect. The intellect is the village idiot compared with knowing, with wisdom that comes from here. And therefore, the whole education system, the media, all of it, all the sources of information are directed at the intellect, not the true self. And so we celebrate scientists because they have a great mind. But do they have a great consciousness beyond mind? And we can change that whenever we choose, because we're in control. The idea that some external force is in control is completely illusory. It is in theoretical control because it's persuaded us we have no power and no control over our lives and no control over events. And why we believe that will be our experience. But we can change it tomorrow, we can change it now, just a choice. To pull this together, I'm saying that what we call the reptilians and also the greys, others too, I say that they are manifestations of this archontic force. And how interesting that the Nag Hammadi texts talk about two of the ways that this archontic force, as I call it, takes form, is through a reptilian form and through a form that is like a grey fetus. And therefore, what the reptilians are doing and what the greys are doing in manipulating human society, and what the human, what I call hybrid elite, reptilian human hybrid elite that people call today's the 1%, I say that that elite and that reptilian grey grouping are manifestations in form of this archontic force. And ultimately, that force, which takes no form, that distortion, is ultimately the one that is manipulating human society. Almost every account I've ever come across, certainly ancient, certainly the Nag Hammadi texts, and certainly people I've come across on the inside in the world today, there's a very, very common theme between all of them, and that's that this force feeds off human low vibrational emotion, different expressions of fear. And I say that it was when this hijack happened that fear came into the world. I say this archontic force, this counterfeit spirit, is what we call fear. And because you can only feed off that which you can make a frequency connection to, if you are fear and you need to absorb energy within your frequency, what energy do you need to create? Fear, and as much of it as possible. Look at the world. I mean, what is the Second World War in terms of fear? And other things like anxiety and all that, violence, conflict. And so if you look at the world from that perspective, yes, we can break down why certain wars are happening and what the sequence is. But from the archontic force point of view, war in itself is an end. Yes, they'll have an ideal sequence because of the way they're manipulating human society, but war in its end is an end in itself. The more war conflict you have, both the individual conflict and collective conflict, then the more of this energy you are creating. Look at the animal kingdom. Look at the non-human kingdoms of this reality. They're killing fields. Everything survives by killing something else. Everything is constantly in fear of the next danger. And I say that is not by coincidence, but by design. So they're feeding off us. And also, the idea is to assimilate us, because very much in the theme of the Borg in the Star Trek series, who, by the way, used to fly around in black cubes, which is an ancient symbol of Saturn. So the assimilation is assimilating human consciousness into itself, just like the Borg talked about, assimilating people into its hive mind, connecting human awareness, human mind to artificial intelligence via technology. What does that create? A hive mind, an assimilation. And then comes the question, what is AI? I say that in its prime form, it is the archontic force. And we, the human race, in our intellectual stupidity, are building a technological vehicle for this force, which doesn't take form in the end, to not only take over human minds, but take the world over. Look at it. AI is taking the world over, and it's only just begun. So this is a whole other area about how the transhumanist agenda is the archontic agenda to assimilate the human race into itself.
There's a worldwide renaissance of Gnostic beliefs currently occurring. This comes at a time when most of the institutions of the past are crumbling. Perhaps these failing empires of false belief systems can be replaced by a world philosophy that celebrates knowledge and curiosity. In our next episode, we'll continue our exploration of the myriad mysteries present throughout the cosmos.